Years ago, after I had been in a minor car accident, in my then 20-year-old ride, I needed to drive a rental for a few days. I parked the rental car in my driveway, and when I wanted to go to work the next morning, the neighbor told me over the fence that it's nice to see that I finally had a car that I don't need to be ashamed of to be parked in front of my house. Now, what made it so natural for her to say this and to think that way? See, humans have existed on this planet for quite a while now. And when it comes to our basic needs, we are probably not much different at all from our ancestors who collected firewood in the forest or wandered the desert in search for water 10,000 years ago. Still, there are lots of people out there who drive down the highway and feel like something big is missing from their lives, because everyone always seems to have a car that is newer, bigger, and shinier than their own. Of course, you can say that same thing about houses, shoes, phones, and just about any other gadget that is thrown on the market these days. There is something for every age, bank account, and social circle to feel envious about. There's always something missing that makes you feel like you lag behind. One reason for that, and you might have heard that phrase before, is that our modern societies and markets are not that much about fulfilling needs, but rather about creating constant new desires. People are constantly made to adapt, to buy, to keep up with the Joneses. One end result is what you see here: an endless waste of energy and materials, and also a whole lot of unhappy people. Now, we all know that it is extremely hard to change the world, and specifically what others think and feel. One thing that you have some control over is your own attitude though, and for those reasons laid out here, I'd urge you to think of those ancestors from long ago and the seemingly endless chain of ever-growing wants and needs that leads from them all the way to us today. One of the best things to help yourself and the world is to break free from that chain and overcome societal pressure. In that sense, you're going to see a guy here working on a bunch of discarded items that he personally still happens to enjoy. In this episode, we're going to work on an over 40-year-old camper trailer that I bought and renovated over 3 years ago. I will also talk about my experiences and the various trips and places where I have been with this thing in the meanwhile. We're also going to fix some vintage audio gear that I recently bought at a thrift store. But we're actually going to start by working on this little quad here that I found at a scrapyard some time ago. We worked on it before, and I'm going to reiterate that shortly before we take this thing to another level. So today's work actually begins on a less serious note. I found this tiny quad here on the scrap a while ago. It's intended for children, but I thought it might be fun to try to ride it anyway. And after I had brought this home, I had started by stripping off the plastic parts and also had to replace one of the tires. Since it had been pretty much stripped clean at the scrapyard, I also had to install an electric motor and a battery. And of course, it looked absolutely ridiculous when I tried to ride it in my garden. Now, this could have been the end of that story. But it just so happens that many of my friends are spending a lot of their time each summer to help to build the structures for a music festival. It's all happening out on a field somewhere, and it can take a while to traverse the festival grounds on foot. That's one reason why the festival has more ridiculous vehicles of various sorts with each passing year, and I was asked over and over again to modify the tiny quad and bring it there. So I finally caved, and here we are. Since we are talking about grown-ups riding a children's vehicle, the first thing that I need to do is to just somehow make it bigger. I brought some steel tubes from that same scrapyard, and what we're going to do is to extend the existing frame. After cutting that frame in some specific spots and removing some of the paint, and also cutting the tubes to the right length, the sections are welded into the existing frame to just make it long enough to use for an adult. The turn radius will not be great, but we are talking about an open field here. After extending the frame, the next thing that I took care of is the brakes. I had installed a new front wheel back when I first obtained this quad, but had forgotten to install a brake disc as well. Since this thing has no rear brakes anymore, it'd be great to at least have both front brakes then. The motor that I had installed here came with a foot pedal, but I decided to replace that with a hand crank instead, like it is also used in some electric bikes. The battery is a 36-volt lithium battery, also from an e-bike. But since I didn't have an adapter or socket that would fit the battery's connector, I had to open the enclosure and lead the wires out of the enclosure directly. This can cause a short circuit if you're not careful, but for that case there actually is a fuse inside a fuse holder built into the battery enclosure. The next step was about fastening the battery to the frame, protecting the quad from rain, and also creating some kind of compartment to put your stuff in while driving around. I decided to just use various leftover aluminium sheets that I still had lying around from other projects. The wire leading to the hand crank was protected with a PVC tube, which was glued in place. I then bent another piece of aluminium into the correct shape to act as a rain cover for the battery and the compartment, and riveted everything together. This sissy bar, in Germany called a bonanza saddle, was given to me with the express wish to install it on the quad, and well, I did what I was told. So yeah, this ended up being a lot of fun, but not particularly great for my back. Let's have a look at this receiver then. It's a German Löwe brand stereo receiver, meaning that it combines an AM and FM radio with an integrated stereo amplifier, which has audio controls, a power amplifier, and also additional source inputs for tape and record player. In other words, a complete stereo system. It's an ST250, and I think it's from around the same time like this old ad for a similar model from the year 1973. The 40 euros price tag is from the thrift store, but this device sat on the shelves for a few months, and I eventually bought it for way less than that. The FM tuner as well as the audio amplifier are actually working just fine. However, I actually bought this to perform some AM experiments with an old AM transmitter that I obtained recently, but unfortunately the one thing not working with this device is the AM tuner. To be more precise, it is no longer possible to adjust the AM frequency, and we'll have to fix that. The piece of string that is supposed to connect the AM tuning knob to the variable capacitor and the AM frequency dial has snapped. This often happens when you try to adjust the frequency while the variable capacitor is actually stuck. You try a little too hard and it rips apart. This is never good news because working on the pulley system of radios of this era is often a complete nightmare, but we're going to do it anyway. Before we proceed to the repair, here are some of the basic building blocks, just for your orientation. This is the mains power supply, and over here we have the power amplifiers for the left and right loudspeakers. Most of the rest of the device is preamps and the actual AM and FM tuners. The AM tuner has a stuck variable capacitor, while the independent FM pulley system still works. Why is that? Well, unlike the AM tuner, the FM tuner doesn't have a variable capacitor that could be stuck. It uses varicap diodes and an additional ordinary potentiometer to adjust the resonant frequency instead, and that pod is simply still moving freely. This was done so that it would be possible to store a number of FM stations and jump between them using this device here, which in German is referred to as a Pneumat. All these knobs connect to little trimmer potentiometers that can be used to set a frequency. By pushing the knobs, you can then jump between these pre-selected stations. The components that actually have variable capacitance are varicap diodes on the PCB. The variable capacitor of the AM tuner, on the other hand, can be found here. I start the repair by carefully removing the broken string. These two little pulleys are also removed and carefully stored in a bin on the workbench. Now the wooden bottom plate is unscrewed so that we can actually access the PCB from the bottom side. After identifying the connections of the capacitor, we can also see that one of the solder joints is damaged as well. Maybe this also happened. As the capacitor got stuck and was harder and harder to move, excessive force was needed to adjust it so that the connections were overstressed. But be that as it may, we have to desolder it anyway now. Ever so carefully, the string is detached from this pulley that is sitting on the capacitor's axle. Later, it will have to be reinserted and wound around the pulley with exactly the right amount of turns and in the correct direction, of course, which is a job that can drive you insane. This component consists of two chambers with two separate variable capacitors. The individual capacitors consist of sets of aluminum surfaces that are facing each other. There's a small air gap between neighboring surfaces, which acts as the capacitor's dielectric. The surfaces must not have contact with each other, or the capacitance will drop to effectively zero. In order to tune an LC resonant circuit with a fixed inductance, you need an adjustable capacitance to change the resonant frequency, which results in listening to a different station. And if you ever learned about capacitors in school, university, or elsewhere, this formula here was probably presented to you. Still, chances are, when you only work with modern electronics, that you have never actually seen a capacitor that looks anything like the plate capacitor that always accompanies this equation in books or here on Wikipedia. The equation simply states that the capacitance of a capacitor will be bigger the larger the common area of two conductors, the smaller the distance between them, and the better an insulator the material separating the surfaces. An old-fashioned adjustable capacitor is basically the closest thing you might ever see to the idealized parallel plate capacitor shown in books. The metal surfaces have a fixed distance between them, and the insulator is always air, meaning that the third variable, area, must be adjustable in order to change the capacitance, because, well, the other two are fixed. The reason why there are more than two surfaces is simply so that you can achieve a higher capacitance within a limited form factor. What you are looking at are several adjustable plate capacitors connected in parallel and mechanically coupled to a common axle. Back to the real world, the axle is stuck though, and that means that the overlap of these surfaces can no longer be adjusted. In order to fix this, a small retaining ring on the inside needs to be rotated around the stuck axle until I can somehow reach the open side of that ring. Using a special set of pliers, the ring is then pushed open and pulled out using a small screwdriver. It sticks to its surface because of the glue-like properties of the old gunky lubricant. Even with the retaining ring gone, the axle still can't be pulled out, because the old lubricant from 1973 has essentially turned into a hard resin that glues the axle to the bushing. It won't budge unless you heat up the axle with hot air. Now it can be pulled out. This only works as long as it's hot though. Once it cools down, the gunk will solidify again and the cap will be stuck once more. I first tried to just wipe off the old lubricant, but it's too tough. Next step, submersion in gasoline. Other solvents like paint thinner work as well here. After that treatment, the gunk can finally be wiped off. I also drench this clean wipe in gasoline to clean the bushing, which is actually just a bore or drill hole, from inside as well. As you can also see here, it's actually almost never the plates that are stuck themselves, but just the axle that connects to the pulley. The bigger of the two gears actually consists of a pair of two gears, one from aluminium and one from brass, that are being pulled together with a small spring, ensuring that there will be no wiggle room, and that the capacitor will not easily drift and stay exactly at the capacitance it was set to. Once you remove the axle, the two gears will lose their original placement, and you can also lose the tiny spring easily, as it is then catapulted away. You have to be aware of that when you pull that out. After applying new grease, everything is put back together. The two gears need to have exactly the correct position for the spring to be reinstalled. After soldering the capacitor back onto the PCB and also fastening it with screws, the old piece of string needs to be reinstalled. I glued its two ends back together with super glue so I can reuse it. This is not a perfect fix, of course, but it works well enough for my purposes. The next part is super hard to film and also extremely frustrating at times. This depiction from the service manual shows the two different sets of pulleys for the AM and FM receivers. They are completely independent of each other, but they do cross each other at one point. Since we only need to fix the AM side of things, I went through the effort of simplifying this depiction first. I don't know how long it took me to get this all back together. When you don't do this every day, the string will constantly be too loose or too tight somewhere and slip off of one of the tiny pulleys, and it can drive you crazy. In our day and age, you often hear the complaint that electronics have made mechanical systems unreliable, and there are certainly ample examples of that, for example in modern cars. On the other hand though, well-designed high-quality electronics like in this receiver can almost last forever, while it's the mechanical systems that cause problems. Lubricants solidifying, fabrics and rubbers getting brittle, and so on. With this being done, both AM and FM can be adjusted freely again. Since there are basically no AM stations left in this country, there's nothing to hear without me testing the AM transmitter I talked about before. We'll have to do that in the future though, since that setup isn't ready yet. On the other hand, a small FM transmitter, like you can buy for your car, can be used to test the FM side of things easily. After having finished that repair, let us also at least have a brief look at another radio receiver here. This is a Blaupunkt Marimba that I also bought at a thrift store. This type of transistor radio that was made around the same time as the Löwe stereo system was referred to as a Kofferradio here in Germany. It means suitcase radio because you can carry it around with a handle. These radios could be battery powered as well, and advertisements from those days will often reflect that. It is also a combined AM and FM radio, and the AM tuner is for short, middle and long wave. It also actually suffers from exactly the same problems like the Löwe system. The variable capacitor is stuck. In this case, it is even worse though, since the cap is necessary for both AM and FM radio here. Removing it was more of a hassle, mostly because the circuits in here are naturally a little more cramped. After removing the capacitor, I went through the exact same steps as before. Removing the retaining ring, heating up the axle, dissolving the old grease, applying new lubricant, and eventually reinstalling the capacitor. Let's deal with a somewhat different subject then. In early 2020, I had bought myself a 4.5 meter long camper trailer made by the German company Bürstner in 1981. It was in an okay technical condition and didn't have any issues from a road safety perspective. However, we wanted to revamp the interior and have it comfortable in there so that we would actually like to spend time in it. A new floor, new furniture and bed, LED lighting and a basic photovoltaic system were installed, to name just a few of all the various repairs and mods that we performed. All of that was covered in an earlier episode, and a link to that is under this video. 3 years later, despite some people's initial skepticism, the more than 40-year-old camper has proven really reliable and we love it. We embarked on several extended trips. Our first 2-week trip led us to the Mecklenburg Lake Plateau in northeast Germany. It is also known as Das Land der Tausend Seen, land of 1,000 lakes, and we absolutely loved it. A year later, in 2021, we embarked on a more daring trip. After short stops in Germany's wine region in the southwest and Bavaria's famous capital, Munich, we eventually crossed the border into Austria. Driving only the windy back roads and no big highways, we traversed the Alps, leaving Austria behind after 2 days. Via a short trip through a beautiful corner of northern Italy, we finally, after many adventurous turns, reached our final destination, Socha Valley in Slovenia. Maybe the most beautiful place I had ever seen, and if you have seen Chronicles of Narnia, Prince Caspian, you might recognize the landscape. Just like back in southern Germany, one of my viewers had invited me to come here, so we were able to camp right inside the national park, only meters away from the Socha River. Thank you so much again for that. And also thank you for all of my viewers who offered us their lawn or driveway to stay for a few nights on that beautiful trip. In 2022, we drove in the completely opposite direction again. Der Spreewald, Spree Forest, situated about 100 kilometers southeast of Berlin, is basically a maze-like wooded inland delta and a real canoeing paradise. And we had a fantastic time there. And now, in 2023, we embarked on our 4th extended trip. This time, we drove again in the completely different direction from last year. Via the Saarland and Strasbourg, we drove to the Black Forest, an extended mountainous region where we found some of the more spectacular spots to camp for the night. Just like in the Alps in 2021, the 42-year-old camper followed us along up and down all the mountains over windy, narrow roads without any issues. The old Subaru Legacy had served me well for about 6 years until a cascade of failures with the pneumatic suspension and eventually the 2.5-liter engine led me to switch to the Forester that I'm driving now. Both cars were very well equipped to haul the camper over the mountains, and overall it seems like a great fit. However, after having used the camper for more than 3 years now, I was getting ready to invest a little more in its future and fix some issues that could eventually turn into real problems. The first thing that I'm going to do here is to complete a project that had started a long time ago. When we first bought the camper, we had removed almost all of the original furniture, and I had built new cabinets from scratch. One little element of it never got finished though. A drawer with a specific purpose to store spices, oils, and some other cooking ingredients that we basically need on every trip. I still had a bunch of offcuts from when we renovated the camper, and also some other random odds and ends. After sketching a plan on a sheet of paper, I basically just had to cut out a whole number of very specifically shaped boards with a jigsaw. I had also bought these massive slides here. They would be needed not only to slide the drawer in and out, but also to hold it firmly in place after being closed. It goes without saying that in a caravan, drawers, cabinet doors and the like cannot be allowed to just slide open randomly while driving around. This problem can be solved using magnets, but in this case, these slides are basically self-closing. You only need to give them a little push and they will pull the drawers in, and it takes a certain amount of force to actually open them again. After using the jigsaw to cut all the necessary parts, everything is screwed and glued together. Some offcuts are used to protect the surfaces of the workpiece from the metal clamps. I would normally do this with wooden woodworking clamps, but I didn't have any of them at hand at the moment. 2 years ago or so, when I made the rest of the cabinet, I already prepared the front panel that you see here on the right hand side. It is eventually fastened to the drawer from the inside. After doing that, it was time to actually install it into the camper. And you have to excuse that there is not a lot of great footage of that. The reason is simply that it is very hard to film while working inside an enclosed space like this, and most of the work happened inside the cabinet where the view is obstructed. With the slides installed and after oiling all the parts in linseed oil, this part was basically finished, but it first needed to dry for a while. I'm currently thinking about adding handles to the cabinet. It holds fast when driving alright, but it's a little hard to open, to be honest. Other than that, we really enjoyed having this while preparing some of the meals on board, like these mushrooms we collected in the Black Forest on our most recent trip. After also installing a new roof hood in the meantime, there was a big problem with one of the big windows of this camper. This window was in poor shape even when we bought it, but it became apparent that it would now only be a matter of time until it would eventually leak or break apart. When you look for this type of window online though, you will quickly find out that even used replacements can cost you between 1,000 and 2,000 euros. The prices have gone way up, especially over the past few years. Before buying something crazy expensive like that, I had come up with a different idea that I was at least willing to try. After taking some measurements, I had this piece of acrylic glass made for me, which cost me around 150 euros. It's 8 mm strong and it already comes with a whole number of drill holes, according to my specifications. In order to hold the window in place, I also bought a number of aluminium extrusions that I still needed to cut to the right angles and lengths and so on. The extrusions would be glued on the edges of the window using flexible MS polymer adhesive. The drill holes are all somewhat wider than the actual bolts used. The bolts are also only screwed to the extrusions and the window somewhat loosely and then secured with some Loctite, but so that there is some wiggle room left. My intention was that the aluminium would be allowed to contract and extend in the sunlight without stressing the acrylic. I hope that I just left enough wiggle room for that. Overall, the entire new window is a little too big. I would simply have to detach the old hinges and fasten them again a few centimeters higher than where they are positioned now. But I'm not willing to do that before testing this window for at least a year or so. My thinking is that there could be an issue with the acrylic and then I might have to order a second version, which could just be smaller, or eventually I install one of the original replacement parts, and in that case it would be bad if I had already repositioned the hinges. In order to hold the window down, and also, as a spacer, I came up with a rather primitive solution. I also made those from aluminium stock. I'm currently working on a more sophisticated part that I will make on the 3D printer though. I installed the window 4 months ago and so far there are no cracks or signs of stress. But I will have to wait a little longer before I can say whether this approach is worth it or not. If you have a look at the original windows, you can see that they also used acrylic fastened to aluminium hinges. I guess the secret is leaving enough wiggle room for the materials to contract and extend at their own rate. I could still try 3 more times, making little improvements each time, and still would have spent less than what I would pay for a used replacement window. So that is what I had in store for you today. We covered some rather diverse topics today, while the last episode focused specifically on one topic, compressors and pneumatics. It's always going to be a mixture of different formats on this channel. But be that as it may, I hope that this episode was informative and entertaining to you, and if that is the case, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps me in keeping my morale up to keep working on the next project. Since YouTube seems to be becoming less and less profitable for me, I would also appreciate it if some of you would think about supporting my future endeavors by making a donation. A link for that is under the video. Or become a supporter on Patreon under patreon.com/tpai. See you soon.